all have moments in life where we feel completely shook up, moments where our life seems to go off track and the story is going in a direction that you and I would have never written the story this way. The day the divorce papers come in the mail, or you get the pink slip at work, or someone close to you dies. And we're left in those moments to ask the question, where's God and how come He's not intervening? He could change the outcome if He simply would. You realize the Christmas story is about lives that were being absolutely shook up. You and I often skip to the end to know what God was actually doing, but you realize it wasn't that way for Mary or for Joseph. That's not how it began. That's why we're here in Nazareth, where the Christmas story begins. It's here that a teenage girl discovers that she's pregnant and has to find a way to describe to her family and her friends that this is actually something that God is doing. And I guarantee you that that generation was just as skeptical of her story as you and I would be if somebody told us that same story today. It's here in Nazareth that Joseph is going to discover that his fiancée is pregnant. He's going to have to make the crucial decision of, do I still marry her or do I put her away? And he's going to be visited by an angel. I guarantee you, in the midst of their lives, they were asking, God, where are you? And why are you doing this to us? You and I now know that God was actually writing the greatest story of all time in the midst of their problems. Mary's going to be 8.5 months pregnant. They'll go over horrible rocky terrain as they make a 2-week journey down to Bethlehem. And it's actually in the midst of their problems that they're going to journey to a place where they can meet Jesus for the very first time. Some would say that God doesn't write stories like that anymore. But I would say to you that in our problems, God often is doing exactly what He did with Mary and Joseph. He's writing unbelievable stories, stories that change our lives, stories that show His power. That in the midst of our problems, God takes you and me to a place where we begin to meet Jesus.
We got a phone call at about 3 in the morning saying we needed to get to the hospital right away. And when we got there, the crash cart was sitting outside his room. His name was Trevor. He was 4 years old. He started acting, sick, like maybe coming down with a cold, the flu, something like that. And suddenly I hear him in the other room screaming at the top of his lungs. I go running in there and he's laying on the bathroom floor just screaming bloody murder and holding his stomach and crying. So we went to urgent care. They did a urine sample and finally came back with that saying, something's really off with this, but we've done as much as we can do. They said you need to go across the street to Chandler Regional to the ER. 2 or 3 hours later, there was a doctor standing there telling us that it was leukemia. They said that the cancer was moving so quickly that we'll start chemo right away. They couldn't keep his oxygen level up at all, and they said we're gonna have to intubate him. They started showing us the numbers. We had learned all about these numbers, and it was to a point that we knew there was no turning back. There was really not that much they could do about it. And they came to us and they said his heart is damaged now from just the cancer attacked it. And they said he can't have chemo with this sort of heart issues. We just knew that that was it. This was going to be the last time that we were really going to see him. Even though he's unconscious, we were delaying the inevitable. And so we made the decision to turn off the ventilator. And he was gone pretty quickly. The doctors and nurses packed up our bags for us that we had been living in the hospital for 2 months. We didn't want to go home. We didn't want to have to try to figure out how to be normal again, because what was that? Thankfully, we had a lot of support from church and from family and from friends, but you know, it came to us to try to figure out what we were going to do. We still miss him here, obviously. There's a big hole without him here, but knowing that he's in heaven and just enjoying the presence of God is so comforting.
And it was very hard to deal with at that time, but I knew that we could rely on God's strength and not our own.
I feel like cancer is a product of a broken world that we live in, and not something that Trevor did or we did. Our hope is always in Christ, and just not ever losing sight of that. He loves us, he cares for us, he is always with us no matter what, because that's what his word promises.
I'm standing here at the temple wall. This is the very same temple that Jesus would have come to when he was a small boy. You get that the world that Jesus was born into was a hyper-religious world filled with thousands of rules. The rules were set up to help people be religious, to help them do things that would commend them to God. It was an incredibly churched-up culture. Matter of fact, every single year they would have come to this temple and they would have brought with them one of the choice lambs out of their herd. Matter of fact, it had to be a perfect lamb without spot or blemish. They then would present that lamb to the priests who would sacrifice it on their behalf, and then God would cover over their sins for a year. So then they had to come back year after year after year, each year sacrificing a lamb. What they missed was that Christmas was God providing the final lamb. When John the Baptist first saw Jesus Christ, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world." When Jesus went to the cross, he died there so that you and I could move from religion into an actual relationship with God himself. Ironically, it was religious people who ultimately had Jesus crucified, proving that you can be around a work of God and not actually know him. You can be churched up and not actually meet him.
I grew up in Chicago. We went to a Catholic church and I was very involved in that. I was an altar boy, and then later on became involved in a church choir. I had a lot of friends, some that were part of the church, some that weren't. But as I got older, I didn't really feel very connected to church. One of the pivotal points for me was around the sacrament of confirmation. I didn't really understand it. Up to that point, it had been pretty easy just to follow along with what people were doing, but confirmation kind of stumped me. I didn't understand it, and it seemed like the more I asked questions, the less answers I got. Going through my teenage years and going to college where I didn't have answers, I started looking at other religions, thinking about other religions. And therefore, I came to appreciate multiple religions, which I didn't really perceive at the time, but it ended up kind of watering down what religion was supposed to be or what faith was supposed to be. There came a point in my life when being self-driven really kind of ran out and failed on me. I really was looking for something more than what I'd found, and I knew that the ways I was trying to go about finding things were not working. People would say, you know, well, you've really got it together, and I would think, no, I really don't. I'm miserable on the inside, but I kind of hid behind that veneer of, yeah, I've got everything. I've got the car, I've got the house, I've got the job, I'm fine, but I really it didn't feel that way. I looked in my rearview mirror and didn't like what I had become, and I didn't like what I had left behind me, and I didn't know how I would ever be forgiven for that. I didn't know how my life could be redeemed. That was how I started to learn about Jesus Christ, that there was a forgiveness and there was a grace there for me. The real turning point in my life happened when my wife and I, we weren't married then, we'd started dating, and she invited me to go to church with her. And that was the first time that I had considered going back to church. It was the first time where I felt like that's where I should be. That's where I had belonged all along. And, it was God speaking through her that said, it's time to come back and try this again. The first time we went to Cornerstone, we felt like this was a church where we could grow, and that's exactly what happened.
Standing in a sheep cave just outside of Bethlehem where Jesus was born. There's urine and sheep feces on the floor, and to be honest, the ambiance is pretty hard to take. We've already talked about the idea that Jesus came for people who were shook up, people whose lives had gone off track and were turning out differently than they ever expected. We also talked about that he came for the churched up, people who were trying through good efforts and kind of man-made rules to make their lives pleasing to God. But maybe the most powerful part of the story is that Jesus came for the messed up. When we visualize the place that Jesus was born, we have a very Western view. We kind of think of a barn. And yet the reality is that Jesus was probably born in a cave very much like this. The manger was probably actually a trough inside the cave for feeding the sheep. Think about that. The Son of God born in a sheep cave, not in a palace, not in a rich man's home, not even in a hospital. Think about the care that you and I take to make sure that our children are born in a place that's clean and sterile, and yet the Son of God was born in a cave. Why? I think God was trying to make a point. I think God was trying to let you and I know that He's willing to come to wherever you and I are in our lives, no matter how messed up, no matter how dirty. Often we try to clean up our lives, and yet the story of Christmas is just the opposite, that Jesus was willing to come and meet us where we were. All of us have been born into sin. All of us have made a mess. We've all done things in our lives that we regret and wish we could take back or do over again. The point is simply this, that Jesus came to lead us out of our mess.
My stepdad and my mom were looking for rehab for me, and they were, they spent, months just trying to find me a place. They couldn't find an option for me because there was no place that would accept a 16-year-old heroin addict. Growing up, it was fairly normal for what I thought. My parents divorced when I was 5, so I always rotated houses. I went over with my dad on the weekends and then my mom throughout the week. There was always drugs in the house. There was always alcohol in the house. He was an alcoholic. There was never like a whole lot of food to eat. There was some good junk food, but there was always beer. And we could hear them in the room and smell the pot that they were smoking. And that's when I started around 12, 13. I started experimenting with everything, and my stepbrother and I, at night, we had a little table in the middle of our room. We had 2 twin beds on the ground, and we had a little skate ramp type table thing. We put a glass mirror on top, We would crush up ecstasy or cocaine or Xanax, and we would do lines together all night. We would get fronted drugs, and we would sell them, and then we would give the cash back to our dealer, and we'd get a profit from that. So it was just always finding basically whatever we can do to make money. I got picked up, got put on probation. That's when I got put into my first rehab and teen challenge. First 2 days I ran away. First 2 weeks ran away again, brought me back. I ended up getting caught. Had to drive about an hour and a half back to Casa Grande in the back of a cop car, handcuffed, which wasn't fun at all, and then had to go to Florence to spend 2 weeks in juvie. Following summer, a year after that, this is after my sophomore year in high school, I didn't come home one night. A cop picked me up and brought me home and says he's not just sick, like he's going through, like he's coming off drugs. They get me to Desert Banner Hospital. I spent 2 days in ICU, and then from there I went into the detox part of it, and I was there for a week. The first 4 days, it was probably the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. I had blood in my stool as well as in my vomit, so I was throwing up blood both ways. My great-grandparents, my mom, my dad, they came down to visit me, and the doctors had told him that you should prepare for him not to make it out of here alive. I didn't get counseling when I was in detox. There was no treatment. It was I got clean and then got out. It got to the point when I was using heroin that I was just sick if I didn't use it, so I just continued to use it because I didn't want to be sick. My mom says, "You're not welcome in our house. You can't live here until you get help." So it was a level 1 lockdown facility rehab. Not quite what I was expecting. Lockdown, no contact with the outside world, and treatment while I'm in there the whole time. My parents saw that my brother and sister started going through similar things that I was going through, and my mom was like, "There's no way we're going through this again with them." So she picked us up and moved from North Scottsdale down here to Chandler about 2.5 years ago. Found Cornerstone. As soon as we walked in the door, we knew this was home. We'd have a conversation 1 week with my parents. The following week, Pastor Lynn would have his sermon on that. And it was pretty much like every week we'd talk about something, he'd speak on it. So it was the Holy Spirit working through him, and something started stirring in me. That same week I started going to Camber. I met someone named Tim Beal, who is the pastor there. This guy is super humble, super down to earth. He's someone I felt I could actually relate to and talk to. And he said things that really hit home for me. That's when my faith became my own, and where I understood that it wasn't so much about what I had to do, the religion part of it. You don't wear a suit and tie, you come to church on Sunday. It was a lot more to that. And that's when I, really gave my life over to Christ and said, "Okay, show me your will." And that, I'd see my life progress from there. Through everything that I've done, how messed up I've been, and, the mistakes that I've made, there's no mistake that I can make that, God still won't love me. He loves me with all his heart, and, the fact that I can do all that and be where I'm at because of his love and his grace is absolutely incredible. There isn't anybody that can do that. I always put my trust in my love in man, and man has always failed me, and God never has.